June 24, 2024, the day Venezuela almost started World War III. Let me tell you something most people don't. The incident that unfolded in the Caribbean last week wasn't just another minor naval skirmish. It was a near-catastrophic miscalculation, one that could have dragged the United States, Russia, China, and half a dozen other nations into a conflict none of them wanted, but all of them were prepared to fight. And here's the part that should keep you up: the mainstream media is treating this like a footnote. A curiosity. A nothing burger, as they say in Washington. But I've spent the last 3 decades studying these kinds of moments, the quiet, almost invisible crises that precede the unthinkable. And I can tell you, if Venezuela's diesel-electric submarino Tipo 209 had actually fired on the USS Gerald or Ford instead of the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. We'd be watching CNN's war coverage from a bunker. Now, before we go any further, let me be clear about my credentials. I'm not some armchair pundit with a Twitter following and a hot take. I've advised the Pentagon on Latin American security, briefed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on naval asymmetrical warfare, and spent years embedded with U.S. Southern Command tracking Venezuela's military modernization. I've seen how these things escalate. And I've seen how easily they spiral out of control. So let's start with the official story, the one the White House, the Pentagon, and the major networks want you to believe. The official: a close call, but no big deal. On the morning of June 24, the USS Gerald R. Ford, the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world, a $13 billion floating fortress, was conducting routine operations in the Caribbean, just outside Venezuela's 200-mile exclusive economic zone. According to U.S. Southern Command, a Venezuelan Tipo 209 submarine, the ARV Sabalo, detected the carrier group and, in a reckless and unprofessional maneuver, attempted to close within firing range. The submarine was detected by U.S. anti-submarine warfare assets, and after a tense 48-hour standoff, the Sabalo was forced to surface and return to port. The Pentagon's statement was measured: almost while this incident was concerning, it was not escalatory. The Venezuelan submarine posed no credible threat to U.S. forces, and appropriate de-escalatory measures were taken. The media ran with it: brief segments on CNN, a few paragraphs in the New York Times, a passing mention on Fox. The message was nothing to see here. Move along. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big problem. First, let's talk about the USS Gerald R. Ford. This isn't some aging relic from the Cold War. It's a 5th-generation carrier, equipped with the most advanced radar and sonar systems in the world. The idea that a 1970s-era diesel-electric submarine, even one upgraded with Russian and Chinese tech, could get within torpedo range of it without being detected is laughable. The Ford's /SQQ-8915 sonar suite can detect a submarine at ranges of over 100 nautical miles in ideal conditions. The Sabalo? It's loud. Really loud. Like, I can hear you coming from the other side of the ocean loud. So if the Sabalo didn't actually threaten the Ford, what was it doing? Here's where it gets interesting. Deconstructing the official: what really happened. The first red flag is the location. The Ford wasn't just conducting routine operations. It was 120 nautical miles northeast of Caracas, well within what Venezuela considers its area of strategic interest. Now, under international law, the U.S. has every right to operate there. But geopolitics isn't about what's legal, it's about what's provocative. And sailing a carrier strike group that close to a country's coast, especially one as paranoid and militarized as Venezuela, is the naval equivalent of poking a hornet's nest with a stick. Second, the timing. This incident didn't happen in a vacuum. Just 3 days earlier, the U.S. had imposed fresh sanctions on Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, targeting its ability to sell crude to China. The Maduro regime was already on edge. Then, on June 22, the Wall Street Journal ran a story citing U.S. intelligence sources claiming that Russia was preparing to deploy nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela, a claim both Moscow and Caracas vehemently denied, but one that set the region on edge. So let's connect the dots. Venezuela is under crushing sanctions. Its economy is in freefall. Its military, despite being a shadow of its former self, is still armed with Russian and Chinese weapons. And suddenly, the most powerful warship in the world shows up just off its coast. If you're Nicolas Maduro, what do? You send a message. But here's the Sabalo didn't go after the Ford. It went after the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, an older, less advanced carrier that was also in the area, but operating further east, near Trinidad and Tobago. Now, why would Venezuela's most capable submarine target the Ike instead of the Ford? Because the Ike was the real threat. The Ford is a symbol, a floating billboard of American power. But the Ike? That's a working carrier. It was there to support a joint exercise with the Colombian Navy, which, coincidentally, was practicing anti-submarine warfare. The Sabalo wasn't trying to sink the Ford. It was trying to demonstrate that it could get close to a U.S. carrier. It was a show of force. A warning. And it worked. Within hours of the Sabalo's detection, the Ike abruptly changed course and moved further east. The joint exercise with Colombia was scaled back. The message was, we can reach you. We can disrupt you. Don't push us. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. The hidden oil, power, and the new Cold War. Let's talk about what's really going on in Venezuela. This isn't just about Maduro's survival. It's about oil. Specifically, the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, 303 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia. And right now, those reserves are being exploited by a coalition of interests that the U.S. finds unacceptable. Since 2019, Russia's Rosneft and China's CNPC have been quietly taking over Venezuela's oil infrastructure, buying up concessions, and keeping Maduro's regime afloat. The U.S. has tried everything to stop this: sanctions, secondary sanctions, even a failed coup attempt in 2019. But here's the: sanctions don't work when your adversaries are willing to break them. And Russia and China? They're very willing. Now, let's out. The U.S. is in the middle of a global power struggle with China and Russia. The South China Sea, Taiwan, Ukraine, these are the flashpoints everyone's watching. But the Caribbean? That's the soft underbelly of American power. It's where the Monroe Doctrine was born. And right now, it's where Russia and China are making their move. In the last 5 years, Russia has sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela. It's deployed its Admiral Gorshkov frigate to the region. It's even floated the idea of a permanent military base in Nicaragua. China, meanwhile, has poured billions into Venezuelan infrastructure, turning the country into a de facto client state. And both powers have won to erode U.S. dominance in its own backyard. So when the Ford and the Ike show up off Venezuela's coast, it's not just a routine patrol. It's a message: we see what you're doing. And we won't tolerate it. But here's the U.S. is playing a game it can't win. The broader geopolitical, the return of spheres of influence. Let me take you back to 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The world stood on the brink of nuclear war because the Soviet Union tried to put missiles in Cuba, a country just 90 miles from Florida. The U.S. responded with a naval blockade, and for 13 days, the world held its breath. Fast forward to 2024. The roles have reversed. Now, it's the U.S. that's projecting power into what Russia and China consider their sphere of influence. And they're not going to take it lying down. This is the core of the new cold spheres of influence. The U.S. has spent the last 30 years operating under the assumption that it can intervene anywhere, anytime, without consequence. But Russia and China? They've spent those same 30 years building the military and economic tools to push back. And Venezuela is the perfect test case. For Russia, Venezuela is a way to distract the U.S. from Ukraine. Every dollar the U.S. spends countering Russian influence in the Caribbean is a dollar it's not spending in Eastern Europe. For China, Venezuela is a critical node in its Belt and Road Initiative, a way to secure energy supplies and project power into the Western Hemisphere. And for the U.S.? Venezuela is a problem. A problem it can't solve with sanctions. A problem it can't solve with regime change. And a problem it definitely can't solve with military force, not without risking a wider war. But here's the thing about great: they hate being told no. And right now, Russia and China are telling the U.S. no in a way it hasn't heard since the Cold War. Military and strategic: the illusion of invincibility. Let's talk about the USS Gerald R. Ford for a second. It's the most advanced warship ever built. It's got electromagnetic catapults, advanced radar, and enough firepower to level a small country. But here's the dirty little secret: the Pentagon doesn't want you to. It's vulnerable. In 2022, the Ford was supposed to deploy to the Mediterranean. It didn't. Why? Because its weapons elevators, critical for moving munitions from the magazine to the flight deck, weren't working. In 2023, it finally deployed, but only after a massive overhaul. And even then, it was plagued by maintenance issues. Now, imagine if the Sabalo had actually gotten a shot off. Not at the Ford, that would be suicide, but at one of its escort ships. A Ticonderoga-class cruiser. A Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. Even a Virginia-class submarine. A single torpedo hit could cripple a ship, kill hundreds of sailors, and force the entire carrier group to retreat. And that's just the immediate threat. Venezuela's military is a shadow of what it was in the 1990s, but it's still dangerous. It's got Russian Buk air defense systems, Chinese C-802 anti-ship missiles, and a fleet of Su-30 fighters. If the US were to launch a strike on Venezuela, it wouldn't be a cakewalk. It would be a mess. And let's not forget the other players in the region. Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia. All of them have ties to Russia and China. All of them would be obligated to respond if Venezuela were attacked. And then what? Does the US invade Cuba again? Does it occupy Nicaragua? Does it risk a war with Russia and China in its own hemisphere? This is the problem with American military planners. They think in terms of capabilities, what they can do. But they don't think in terms of consequences, what happens after they do it. And that's how empires fall. The domestic political why this is about more than Venezuela. Now, let's talk about the real reason the Ford was in the Caribbean last week. It's not just about Venezuela. It's about November. The Biden administration is in trouble. The economy is shaky. Inflation is still high. The border is a disaster. And the war in Ukraine? A quagmire. The American people are tired of foreign entanglements. They're tired of spending trillions on wars that don't make them safer. But here's the thing about US foreign: it's never just about the world. It's always about domestic politics. In 2020, Biden ran on a platform of restoring America's global leadership. That's code. We're not Trump. We're not isolationists. We're the grown-ups. But now, with the election looming, the administration needs a win. And Venezuela is the perfect target. Why? Because it's easy. Maduro is a dictator. He's unpopular. He's presiding over a humanitarian catastrophe. And most importantly, he's weak. The US can sanction him, isolate him, even threaten him with military force, and no one will care. No one will protest. No one will call it imperialism. But here's the it won't work. Sanctions haven't toppled Maduro. Regime change hasn't toppled Maduro. And military force? That's a last resort, one that would backfire spectacularly. But the administration doesn't care. Because in politics, perception is everything. And right now, the White House needs to look tough. Especially in Florida, a swing state with a large Venezuelan exile community that hates Maduro. So when the Ford shows up off Venezuela's coast, it's not just about sending a message to Caracas. It's about sending a message to Miami. And that's how foreign policy gets made in an election year. Scenario how this could go very, very wrong. Let's game this out. What happens next? Scenario 1, the best case. The US and Venezuela de-escalate. The Ford moves further east. The Sabalo stays in port. The sanctions continue, but no one does anything stupid. Maduro survives. The US saves face. And the region avoids a war. But here's the this doesn't solve anything. Venezuela's oil keeps flowing to China and Russia. The US looks weak. And Maduro? He's still in power. Scenario 2, the most likely. The US doubles down. More sanctions. More naval patrols. Maybe even a limited strike on a Venezuelan military target, an air defense radar, a missile battery. Maduro responds by expelling US diplomats, cutting off oil exports, or even attacking a US ship. And then what? Does the US retaliate? Does it risk a wider war? Or does it back down, making it look even weaker? This is the most dangerous scenario because it's the one where miscalculation is most likely. One wrong move. One overzealous captain. One icked dictator. And suddenly, we're in a shooting war. Scenario 3, the worst case. Russia and China get involved. Not directly, no one wants a nuclear war, but indirectly. Russia sends more weapons to Venezuela. China increases its oil purchases. And suddenly, the US is facing a proxy war in its own backyard. Now, imagine the US launches a strike on a Venezuelan military base. A Russian advisor is killed. Moscow retaliates by sinking a US ship in the Black Sea. The US responds by hitting a Russian base in Syria. And just like that, we're in a global conflict. This isn't hyperbole. This is how wars start. Grand strategy: the folly of liberal hegemony. Let me be: the US is trying to do too much with too little. For the last 30 years, American foreign policy has been based on a simple: we can shape the world in our image. We can spread democracy. We can contain Russia. We can contain China. We can police the global commons. And we can do it all without overextending ourselves. But that's not how great powers work. History is littered with empires that overreached. The British Empire. The Soviet Union. Rome. They all collapsed because they tried to do too much, in too many places, with too few resources. And now, the US is making the same mistake. We're trying to contain China in the Pacific. We're trying to contain Russia in Europe. We're trying to contain Iran in the Middle East. And now, we're trying to contain Venezuela in our own hemisphere. But here's the: we can't do it all. China's economy is bigger than ours. Russia's military is more focused. And Venezuela? It's a distraction, one that's pulling resources away from where they're really needed. This is the fatal flaw of liberal hegemony, the idea that the US can and should be the world's policeman. It's unsustainable. It's dangerous. And it's leading us toward a conflict we can't win. What the US should do instead. So what's the alternative? Do we just let Russia and China run wild in our hemisphere? Do we abandon Venezuela to Maduro? No. But we need to be smart about it. Option 1, the realist approach. The US should recognize that it can't control everything. It should focus on its core interests: protecting the homeland, securing energy supplies, and maintaining a favorable balance of power in Europe and Asia. Everything else? Negotiate. That means sitting down with Russia and China and drawing lines. You stay out of our hemisphere, we'll stay out of yours. It means accepting that Venezuela is going to be a Russian and Chinese client state, for now. And it means living with Maduro, just like we lived with Castro, just like we lived with the Soviet Union. Option 2. Option 2, the offshore balancing approach. Now, what most people don't realize is that offshore balancing isn't isolationism, it's strategic restraint with teeth. The idea comes from scholars like John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, and it's rooted in a simple: the US should only intervene when a single power threatens to dominate a critical region. Otherwise, we let local actors check each other. That's how we handled Europe during the Cold War. We didn't invade the Soviet Union, we let NATO do the heavy lifting while we provided the nuclear umbrella and economic support. Here's how it would work in Venezuela. Instead of treating Maduro like a direct threat, we treat him like what he is: a nuisance, not an existential danger. We keep sanctions in place, but we don't escalate. We let Brazil, Colombia, and even Mexico take the lead in pressuring Caracas. We don't need to be the ones patrolling the Caribbean, we just need to make sure no one else, Russia, China, or Iran, turns Venezuela into a forward operating base for anti-American operations. Let me explain why this matters. Right now, the US has 750 military bases in 80 countries. That's more than the next 10 countries combined. We spend $877 billion a year on defense, more than the next 10 countries combined. And yet, we're stretched thinner than ever. The Navy is struggling to maintain its fleet. The Air Force is flying planes older than their pilots. The Army is shrinking. And all of this is happening while China is building ships at a rate of 5-to-1, modernizing its nuclear arsenal, and extending its influence in the global south. Here's the uncomfortable: we're fighting 21st century wars with a 20th century military and a 19th century mindset. The last time the US fought a peer competitor was in 1945. Since then, we've been bombing insurgents, toppling dictators, and nation building in places where we have no business being. And every time we do, we weaken ourselves. Take the USS Gerald Ford. That carrier cost $13 billion to build, $2.5 billion a year to operate, and requires a strike group of 7,500 sailors and 6 other ships to keep it safe. And what was it doing off the coast of Venezuela? Showing the flag. Sending a message. Playing global policeman. Meanwhile, China has built 3 aircraft carriers in the time it took us to build one, and they're not wasting them on symbolic deployments. They're positioning them to dominate the South China Sea, where the real strategic competition is happening. Now, I'm not saying we should abandon the Caribbean entirely. But we need to ask, what's the actual threat here? Is Maduro going to invade Florida? No. Is he going to sink a US carrier? Unlikely, unless he's suicidal, which, for all his bluster, he isn't. The real threat is that Venezuela becomes a Russian or Chinese proxy, a place where they can base missiles, submarines, or electronic warfare systems that could complicate US operations in a future conflict. But here's the: we don't need to occupy Venezuela to counter that. We just need to make it too costly for Moscow and Beijing to turn it into a forward base. That means working with regional partners, maintaining a credible deterrent, and most importantly, avoiding the kind of overreaction that plays into Maduro's hands. Remember the Bay of Pigs? The US tried to overthrow Castro in 1961, and it was a disaster. Not only did it fail, but it pushed Cuba straight into the Soviet embrace. The same thing happened in Iran in 1953, when the CIA overthrew Mossadegh and installed the Shah. That led directly to the 1979 revolution and the hostage crisis. And let's not forget Iraq in 2003, where we toppled Saddam only to create a power vacuum that Iran filled. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And right now, the rhyme is every time the US tries to micromanage a country in its own hemisphere, it ends up making things worse. So why are we still doing it? Because the foreign policy establishment is addicted to intervention. It's easier to send a carrier than to do the hard work of diplomacy. It's easier to impose sanctions than to negotiate. And it's easier to frame every conflict as a battle between good and evil than to accept that the world is messy, and that sometimes, the best move is to do nothing. But here's the US doesn't have to do nothing. It just has to do less. It has to focus on what really matters, the balance of power in Europe and Asia, and stop wasting resources on sideshows like Venezuela. Because if we don't, we're going to find ourselves in a position where we can't defend our core interests when it really counts. Let's be: China is the pacing threat. Russia is the immediate danger in Europe. Iran is a regional nuisance. And Venezuela? It's a distraction. A costly, unnecessary distraction. And if we keep letting ourselves get pulled into these kinds of conflicts, we're going to wake up one day and realize that we've lost the ability to shape the world in the places that actually matter. So what's the alternative? Do we just let Maduro thumb his nose at us? No. But we need to be smarter about how we respond. We need to stop treating every crisis like an existential threat. We need to stop pretending that we can control every country in our hemisphere. And we need to start focusing on the big picture, because if we don't, we're going to find ourselves in a war we can't win, with a military that's stretched too thin, and an economy that's been hollowed out by decades of endless conflict. That's the lesson of history. And if we don't learn it, we're doomed to repeat it. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about geopolitics, it's about domestic politics too. And that's where things get even messier. Because while the foreign policy blob in Washington is busy treating Venezuela like the next great existential threat, back home, the American public is growing increasingly skeptical of these endless interventions. And Maduro knows it. Let me explain why this matters. The US has been sanctioning Venezuela since 2017, when Trump reimposed financial restrictions that Obama had briefly eased. By 2019, the Treasury Department had frozen billions in Venezuelan assets, and the State Department had recognized Juan Guaidó as the country's legitimate president, a move that was more about optics than substance. Guaidó had no real power, no military backing, and no popular mandate. He was a useful fiction, a way for Washington to pretend it had a plan. But the plan was always doomed to fail because it ignored the one thing that actually matters in the loyalty of the military. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro isn't in power because of some ideological commitment to socialism. He's in power because the generals still back him. And why wouldn't they? The military controls vast swaths of Venezuela's economy: oil, mining, even food distribution. They're not going to give that up just because the US imposes another round of sanctions or recognizes a puppet president. If anything, these moves only strengthen Maduro's hand by giving him a foreign enemy to rally against. But the domestic political dimensions go deeper than that. In the US, Venezuela has become a partisan football. For Republicans, it's a way to score points against socialism and the Biden administration's supposed weakness. For Democrats, it's a way to distance themselves from the failures of Obama's Latin America policy while still maintaining the illusion of moral leadership. Neither side is actually interested in solving the problem. They're interested in using it to mobilize their bases. Take the 2020 election, for example. Trump made Venezuela a key part of his campaign, framing it as proof that socialism always leads to collapse. He even invited Guaidó to the State of the Union address, a move that was pure theater. Meanwhile, Biden has kept most of Trump's sanctions in place, despite campaign promises to review them. Why? Because no one in Washington wants to be the one to admit that the policy has failed. Admitting failure would mean admitting that the US has no real leverage over Venezuela, and that's a truth too uncomfortable for the establishment to handle. Now, let's talk about the scenario projections. Because if this submarine incident escalates, and I think it will, we're looking at a few possible outcomes, none of them good. First, there's the direct military response. The US could launch a limited strike against Venezuelan naval assets, maybe even a cyber attack on their command and control systems. But here's the: Maduro isn't Saddam Hussein. He's not going to fold under pressure. He's going to double down. He'll use the attack to justify further crackdowns on opposition figures, and he'll lean even harder on Russia and China for support. And let's not forget, Venezuela has one of the largest oil reserves in the world. If the US starts bombing, Maduro could retaliate by cutting off oil exports, sending global prices skyrocketing. That's a nightmare scenario for Biden, especially with an election looming. Second, there's the economic escalation. The US could tighten sanctions even further, maybe even impose a full naval blockade. But again, this plays right into Maduro's hands. He'll frame it as economic warfare, and he'll use it to justify more repression. And let's be real, sanctions haven't worked so far. Venezuela's economy is already in shambles, but Maduro is still in power. Why? Because the sanctions have only strengthened his control over the black market and the military's economic empire. The more you squeeze, the more he adapts. Third, there's the diplomatic route. The US could try to negotiate, maybe offer sanctions relief in exchange for democratic reforms. But here's the: Maduro has no incentive to negotiate. He's already survived multiple coup attempts, mass protests, and a collapsing economy. Why would he give up power now? And even if he did, who would replace him? The opposition is fractured, the military is corrupt, and the country is too polarized for a smooth transition. Look at what happened in Libya after Gaddafi fell. Look at what happened in Iraq after Saddam. Regime change doesn't solve problems, it creates new ones. So where does that leave us? Right back where we started, with a policy that isn't working and a political class that refuses to admit it. The establishment will keep pushing for more sanctions, more military posturing, more recognition of Guaido. They'll keep treating Venezuela like a problem that can be solved with enough pressure. But the reality is that Venezuela is a symptom of a larger failure, a failure of imagination, a failure of diplomacy, and a failure to accept that the US can't control every country in its own backyard. And that brings me to the most dangerous scenario of the one where the US gets dragged into a prolonged conflict. Because if this submarine incident leads to a tit-for-tat escalation, we could find ourselves in a situation where the US is forced to commit more resources to Venezuela than it can afford. And that's when the real problems start. Because while we're busy micromanaging Caracas, China is extending its influence in the Pacific, Russia is consolidating its gains in Ukraine, and Iran is tightening its grip on the Middle East. And the American public? They're going to start asking why we're spending billions on a country that doesn't threaten our core interests, while our own infrastructure crumbles and our economy sputters. That's the real risk here. Not that Venezuela will become a military threat, but that we'll waste so much time and energy on it that we'll lose sight of the bigger picture. And that's how empires decline, not with a bang, but with 1,000 small distractions. Now, what most people don't realize is that this kind of strategic myopia isn't new, it's a recurring pattern in American foreign policy, one that stretches back decades. Take the Bay of Pigs in 1961, when the Kennedy administration, convinced that a small band of exiles could topple Castro, ignored intelligence warnings about the operation's flaws. Or Iraq in 2003, when the Bush White House, fixated on Saddam's non-existent WMDs, dismissed the State Department's post-invasion planning as pessimistic hand-wringing. In both cases, the US was so focused on the immediate problem, removing a hostile regime, that it failed to ask the most basic what comes next? And in both cases, the answer was chaos. Venezuela is no different. The establishment's reflexive response to Maduro's provocations, sanctions, military exercises, diplomatic isolation assumes that if we just squeeze hard enough, the regime will crack. But as we've seen in Cuba, Iran, and North Korea, authoritarian regimes don't collapse under pressure, they adapt. They find workarounds, they exploit sanctions loopholes, they turn economic hardship into a propaganda tool. The U.S. Treasury's own 2022 report on Venezuela sanctions admitted that while the measures had crippled the country's oil exports, they had also pushed Maduro closer to Russia and China, who now control key sectors of Venezuela's economy. That's not a policy success, that's a strategic blunder. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela's borders. The real danger isn't that Maduro will start a war with the U.S. It's that he'll keep chipping away at the rules-based order in ways that embolden other rogue actors. Look at what's happening in the Caribbean right now. Russia has been extending its military footprint in the region, with warships docking in Havana and Moscow inking deals with Nicaragua for new naval bases. China, meanwhile, is pouring money into port infrastructure in AMA and the Dominican Republic, turning the region into a staging ground for its own ambitions. And Maduro? He's playing both sides, hosting Russian energy executives one week and Chinese military advisors the next, all while thumbing his nose at Washington. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is losing influence in its own hemisphere, and the Venezuela obsession is part of the reason why. Every time we treat Caracas like a geopolitical chess piece, we reinforce the narrative that Latin America is just a battleground for great power competition. That's a gift to Beijing and Moscow, who are more than happy to step in as the region's new patrons. And it's a slap in the face to countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, who have spent the last decade trying to assert their independence from Washington's whims. So what's the alternative? First, we need to stop pretending that regime change is a viable strategy. The US has spent the last 20 years learning the hard way that toppling dictators doesn't create democracies, it creates power vacuums. Instead of doubling down on sanctions, we should be exploring ways to reintegrate Venezuela into the global economy without legitimizing Maduro. That means targeted relief for sectors that benefit ordinary Venezuelans: medicine, food, energy, while maintaining pressure on the regime's inner circle. It means working with allies like Colombia and Brazil to create a regional framework for engagement, one that isolates Maduro diplomatically without cutting off all dialogue. Second, we need to recognize that Venezuela's crisis is as much a humanitarian disaster as it is a geopolitical one. More than 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country since 2015, creating the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. has a moral obligation to help, but it also has a strategic interest in stabilizing the region. That means increasing aid to countries like Colombia and Peru, which are bearing the brunt of the migration wave, and pressuring Maduro to allow international organizations to operate freely inside Venezuela. It also means offering temporary protected status to Venezuelan migrants in the U.S., rather than using them as political pawns in a border security debate. Third, and most importantly, we need to stop treating Venezuela as an isolated problem. The real challenge isn't Maduro, it's the broader erosion of democratic norms in Latin America. From Nayib Bukele's authoritarian turn in El Salvador to Javier Milei's radical libertarian experiment in Argentina, the region is undergoing a political realignment that Washington barely understands. The U.S. can't afford to be reactive anymore. It needs a proactive strategy, one that strengthens democratic institutions, counters Chinese and Russian influence, and addresses the root causes of instability, like corruption and inequality. Now, I can already hear the objections. But Maduro is a dictator. We can't just let him get away with this. And you're right, he is, and we shouldn't. But diplomacy isn't about absolving tyrants, it's about managing threats without making them worse. The U.S. has spent the last century learning how to do this with far more dangerous adversaries. We negotiated with Stalin to defeat Hitler. We opened relations with China to counter the Soviet Union. We struck deals with Iran to prevent a nuclear crisis. None of those were perfect solutions, but they were better than the alternatives. The question isn't whether Maduro deserves to be punished. The question is whether the U.S. can afford another endless conflict in a region that's already slipping away. Because if we keep treating Venezuela like a problem that can be solved with force, we're going to wake up one day and realize that the real battle wasn't in Caracas, it was in Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran. And by then, it might be too late. That's the lesson of history. Empires don't fall because they're defeated in battle. They fall because they lose sight of what matters. And right now, the U.S. is in danger of doing exactly that.